I'm the Director of Policy and Campaigns at Nature Canada. I'll be your MC for this event. Thank you all for joining us. We are so excited to be bringing this webinar to your screens today. Nature Canada is a national organization. It has been a voice for nature for over 80 years, advocating for the protection and restoration of land, water, and ocean to help stop species and ecosystem collapse. We facilitate mobilizing among more than 900 nature organizations and 100,000 nature lovers across the country, and we're helping people connect to nature. All of you joining us today are in different locations, but we are all on Indigenous land. I'm speaking to you from unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa, ancestral lands that the Algonquin Anishinaabe people continue to occupy. We are thrilled we'll be joined today by the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson, Canada's Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and the Honourable Bernadette Jordan, Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, for a conversation with you and nature organizations about the future of conservation in Canada as we work to prevent species collapse and fight climate change. The panel with the ministers will be moderated by Nature Canada's Executive Director, Graham Saul. While the webinar will be hosted in English today, certainement vos questions, vos commentaires pour les ministres seront très bienvenus en français. During the event, you can use the Q&A box to ask a question. This is the final event in our third annual Nature on the Hill Days. This past week, 60 nature groups from across the country met virtually with dozens of parliamentarians to call for scaled up federal investments to create protected areas and support Indigenous-led conservation of land and ocean. Today's Town Hall for Nature is now the public's turn to hear what nature groups have been raising with decision makers and to ask your own questions about the future of the nature that we all depend on. To kick off the conversation, you're about to hear from 3 different nature groups, all unique in their work from different parts of the country, to share with us what they see as priorities for action for nature. Shortly, you'll meet Rebecca Clapperton-Law from Nature Kids BC, Mariam Bahed from Green Umma in Toronto, and Jordy Thompson from Ecology Action Centre in Halifax. After that, we'll move to a panel discussion where the ministers can respond to those concerns and then share their own views about the future of conservation in Canada and answer your questions. Let's get started with a perspective from the West Coast. Rebecca, over to you.
Morning, everyone. Thanks, Gowrie. My name is Rebecca Clapperton-Law, and I'm the Executive Director of Nature Kids BC. Thanks very much for the invitation to join in this morning. I'm joining from Vancouver, the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations peoples. So for the past 20 years, our organization has provided children and the grown-ups who care for them with year-round outdoor experiences in natural surroundings across the province in the belief that they will be inspired by a love of nature, its diversity, its complexity, and will make ecologically responsible decisions as they grow older. We also know that kids need nature for their personal development. Spending quality time outdoors improves their health, their happiness, their ability to focus. We could say the same for ourselves. As you can see from the screen, when our kids, our nature kids, connect with nature and appreciate it, some pretty special moments occur. These moments are precious, and they're key to building a nature-positive country. Every time a child learns the name of a bird, gets their hands dirty planting a tree, we're creating a point where change can happen. And our community is creating those moments every day. Yet, even as this generation of children is growing up, the state of the natural world is becoming increasingly dire. And in Canada, wildlife populations are declining faster than they can be recovered. Research shows that our changing land use and climate crisis are accelerating this nature loss. As a global leader for nature, Canada is committed protecting 30% of land, freshwater, and oceans by 2030, more than double what's protected now. That's an ambitious target. But if met, it would mean that our kids could be living on a healthier planet by the time they hit their 20s. And this, of course, is when they're charting out their vocations, after they've weathered milestones of life with the benefit of resilience from their connection to nature. Protecting these areas will take partnerships, time, and lots of money. So today I'd love to hear the ministers express clearly if the government is prepared to start investing at the scale required to hit that target, to make these kids' futures one filled with nature. Experts say it will take at least $5 billion over the next 5 years. Can we be hopeful? Thanks. I'll pass the mic to Miriam.
Hello and bonjour. My name is Miriam Bahed, and I am the chair of Green Ummah. I'm speaking today from Mississauga, which is located in the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Green Ummah is a nonprofit founded just over a year ago to foster a deeper relationship between nature and Muslim communities across Canada. We believe that these relationships are a critical component of addressing climate change and environmental injustices. We are currently working to create digital materials for educators interested in teaching about topics like environmental justice. Our work is driven by a belief that the environmental movement must be inclusive to succeed. We know that there are unique challenges to accessing nature faced by racialized communities. During COVID-19, we've all realized the importance of accessing green spaces for our mental health. Imagine what it would be like to live in a neighborhood without or with minimal green spaces during this difficult time. This is the reality that many communities face. As an organization, we are committed to creating space to respond to questions like, how can we build an inclusive green movement? And how can we nurture Muslim allyship with Indigenous communities? These questions are critical as we seek to engage diverse perspectives on how to create a green future in Canada. We know it is important for this work to be done in collaboration with our government. One of the themes I would love the panel to address today is the role the federal government can play in bringing nature to communities on a more equitable and inclusive basis, so all people living in Canada can feel connected to the nature we have across the country. J'ai hâte de recevoir vos réponses. Thank you, and over to you, Jordy.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you, ministers, for being with us today. My name is Jordy Thompson, and I'm a senior marine coordinator at the Ecology Action Centre based in Halifax. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining the event today from the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The EAC is a member-based charity that works on a wide range of issues connected to biodiversity loss, climate change, and environmental justice. We work all the way from grassroots community level up to international policy to help achieve a just and sustainable future, both for people and for the environment. And today I'd like to ask you a question about the oceans. As we continue to learn more about the importance of healthy oceans for our lives and our livelihoods, we're at the same time faced with the reality of the depth of the biodiversity and climate crises and the urgent need for sustained action, which is what brings us together today. As you know, protected areas can be a cornerstone of an effective strategy for reducing biodiversity loss and helping to address climate change, while also having benefits for a sustainable economy. I'd like to commend the government for the establishment of new protected areas on all 3 of Canada's coasts and exceeding the target of 10% protection by 2020. And I'd also like to thank you for the ambitious steps taken to set new targets for 2025 and 2030, as well as for your international leadership on this issue. At the same time, we know that all Canadian protected areas are not created equal. For example, in Atlantic Canada, some of our marine refuges, including our largest, the Northeast Newfoundland Slope, are still at risk from some industrial activities such as oil and gas. This poses a particular threat to sensitive sea bottom species like corals and sponges, which provide valuable habitat for many other species, and they also support our fisheries. So I was hoping today that you could talk a little bit about the importance of strong protection standards and how you will ensure that quality protection is achieved for all sites as you work toward the 2030 target. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Jordy, Rebecca, Miriam. Those perspectives were so important. It sets the stage really well for the ministers to respond in our panel discussion. I'm going to hand it over to you, Graham, our Executive Director for Nature Canada and the moderator for the next conversation.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to our partners for providing that kickoff for our discussion with the honorable ministers. Let me introduce them. Bernadette Jordan is the Federal Minister of Fisheries and Oceans in the Canadian Coast Guard. She is the Member of Parliament for South Shore, St. Margaret's in Nova Scotia. She worked in healthcare philanthropy before being elected to office. Welcome, Minister Jordan. Thank you for being here. Jonathan Wilkinson is the Federal Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada. and the Member of Parliament for North Vancouver. Before being elected to office, he was a leader in the clean technology sector. Welcome to you, Minister Wilkinson. I'd like to begin by asking the two of you for opening remarks and a response to what we just heard from the three local nature organizations. Let's go to Minister Wilkinson first. Minister Wilkinson?
Thank you very much. I did have some prepared remarks, but I actually think maybe I'll just speak for a few minutes to some of the comments, but perhaps a little bit more generally to some of the environmental issues. We, as everybody here knows, are facing twin crises. There is the crisis that is climate change, and then there is the crisis that is rapid biodiversity loss in this world. They are obviously completely intertwined, but stopping climate change doesn't necessarily arrest biodiversity loss. There are many other issues in play, including protection and conservation of wild spaces and ecosystems, the appropriate protection of species at risk, on working landscapes. We need to ensure that we are actually addressing both crises, so that we do, as we move past this pandemic, think about a world that will be a more sustainable world on a go-forward basis. With respect to climate change, I think people will know the Prime Minister and I announced a new and strengthened climate plan in December of this year, which is the first plan, a very, very detailed plan for those who have not had a chance to read it, that provides Canadians visibility on how we will not only meet, but we will exceed our current Paris Agreement targets, and we will continue to work to be more ambitious over time. It includes a whole range of different measures, but some of them relate to nature. There is about $4 billion in there for nature-based solutions, which is not just planting trees, but a significant amount of money for the restoration of wetlands and grasslands, which from a carbon sequestration perspective are actually perhaps faster than growing trees, but are also important from a biodiversity perspective. With respect to nature and biodiversity, we have committed to 30 by 30 and 25 by 25. We have made enormous progress over the course of the first few years. We went from 1% of marine protected areas to 14%. We are now at 13%, with a track to getting to the 17% target by 2023, and we have committed to 25% by 2025. That has been done very much in partnership with Indigenous communities. Certainly many of the marine areas were in partnership with different Indigenous communities, particularly Inuit in the north. But there's been a lot of progress on terrestrial with Indigenous protected and conserved areas in the south. And I would say that we have kind of a three-pronged strategy with respect to how we are going to go forward on a terrestrial perspective to building towards 25 by 25 and 30 by 30. A southern strategy which relates to how do we bring nature closer to communities, that includes the creation of new urban parks and working with municipalities, creating ecological corridors, trying to ensure that there are opportunities for communities to interact with nature that are proximate to where Canadians live and that are proximate to where our children are. Again, I do think the connection between our kids and nature is an incredibly important conversation that we need to be having. A mid-Canada strategy where a lot of our extractive industries are, but a lot of our biodiversity are, which is really focused on, yes, some protected and conserved areas, but also looking at practices with respect to industrial activity to ensure that we are addressing appropriately things like species at risk for many species, but certainly iconic species like caribou. And then in the north, where we still have wild and intact ecosystems, protecting those areas, often in partnership with Indigenous communities, looking at areas where there is important issues around carbon and keeping carbon in the ground as well as biodiversity. That is certainly very, very important. And so I would say that we certainly are looking to have a comprehensive strategy that is one that is focused both on climate and nature. I would just make one comment to the Ecology Action Center at the end, which is there are standards, and we've had this conversation a few times when I was Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. I understand the issue with respect to the slope. But if in fact there were ever industrial activity in a marine refuge, it doesn't count. And that was part of the whole discussion and the process for establishing those standards that were actually announced in Montreal at the Nature Summit. But certainly happy to engage that conversation as well.
Minister Jordan?
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'm pleased to be here today to join with you as well as with my colleague, Minister Wilkinson, to have this important discussion that we need to have today. And I am joining you today from Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia. And I'm inspired to see so many people joining us today from different organizations right across the country. So thank you to Nature Canada for organizing this and bringing us together to discuss these urgent issues that are facing our planet and our communities. Our world's oceans are facing many threats: climate change, illegal and dangerous fishing practices, marine pollution, habitat degradation. But as Minister of Fisheries, Ocean, and as a coastal Canadian, I'm proud to be part of a government that has made ocean health a top priority. And that has taken real and consistent action to protect our oceans. When we formed government in 2015, we had a lot of work to make up for. Less than 1% of our oceans were protected. But with hard work, strong partnerships with provincial, territorial, and Indigenous governments, smart marine spatial planning, serious investments in science and conservation, we've definitely turned a corner. Now nearly 14% of our ocean territory is protected, and that's an area almost twice the size of Newfoundland and Labrador. And I do want to say a special thank you to Minister Wilkinson for his hard work to getting us to the 14%. But now we're moving towards 25 by 25. And Canada has also moved from the sidelines of oceans protection to become a global leader. Last summer, we joined the United Kingdom's Global Ocean Alliance to advocate for a global target of 30% by 2030. Internationally, we continue to advance the Ocean Plastics Charter to address marine plastics pollution by encouraging ambitious international action and cooperation by governments, businesses, and organizations. We're also following through on our commitments that Canada made with the G7 Charlevoix Blueprint on healthy oceans, seas, and resilient coastal communities. Our Prime Minister is a proud member of the High Level Panel, a network of ocean nations working toward more sustainable management of marine resources, and we're a top contributor to the World Bank's Pro-Blue Fund. Canada has the resources and territory to be a world leader in how we treat our oceans, and now we are. But one thing that we often forget is that protecting our oceans is not simply the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. What's good for our oceans is good for all of us. Canada's ocean economy accounts for approximately $31.5 billion of our GDP and 300,000 jobs in fisheries, aquaculture, energy, shipping, tourism, and recreation. But for the country with 3 oceans and the longest coastline in the world, there's a lot of room for growth. And as we move towards a post-COVID world, our ocean sector are going to be critical to job creation and boosting our coastal economies. That's why we're developing the Sustainable Blue Economy Strategy to guide federal investments, actions, and policies towards a single goal: to get more Canadians working on and in the water. Just as Canadians need a climate plan to meet net zero, we need a blue economy strategy to make our ocean industries more sustainable, more diverse, and more prosperous. Last week, we launched the first of several public engagement sessions on the strategy, and will provide a framework for coordinated federal action in Canada's ocean space. And I look forward to the roundtable I'm having later today with Nature Canada. At this session and here today, I know we'll talk about how our ocean industries can be more sustainable, or bluer. A blue economy is one where human beings can work with the ocean on its terms, one where ocean health is non-negotiable, because a healthy ocean has more to give. A healthy ocean reduces greenhouse gas emissions by nearly 20%. A healthy ocean is home to millions more fish and marine life. A healthy ocean is one that industry and workers can rely on. A healthy ocean feeds more mouths, employs more people, and generates more revenue for the entire country. We have a responsibility to protect oceans for present and future generations. And I want to thank everyone who helped make Nature Day on Parliament Hill such a success. Each of you are eco-experts in your own right, and your passion to help ensure our oceans are clean and healthy, resilient and productive for many generations to come. So I want to thank you for inviting me here today. I also just want to take a second with regards to some of the things that were mentioned earlier from our speakers. Rebecca and Miriam, I really appreciated your comments with regards to getting more people active in nature. I would really like to know how we do that with regards to the ocean space as well. I'd love to see more youth involved in our ocean space and getting kids involved so that they can make the right decisions later on in life is going to be extremely important. And Jordy, with regards to, the urgent need for sustained work, I mean, we are absolutely committed to our 25% by 2025. Work is ongoing in that area. We can talk more about that as we move forward with these conversations today. But I wanted to, I guess, turn it back over to you, Graham, to lead the discussion on where we go from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciated. I'd actually like to do a couple follow-ups on those first three questions. Minister Jordan, could you speak to Jordy's concern that oil and gas development could, in certain circumstances, threaten marine refuges and marine protected areas?
So, with regards to marine protected areas, we know that the best marine protected areas are built from the ground up. They're built in collaboration with communities, with the people who are using the ocean space, and that's one of the things I think is going to be extremely important as we go forward. The 2025 target is well underway. We are looking at where we're going to get the next 16% to get us to where we need to be, 11%, and then onwards to 30-30. We have to make sure that we're engaging with our organizations, with communities, with industries, to make sure that we are protecting what needs to be protected. And I know Minister Wilkinson was extremely involved in this as well whenever he was Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. I'm not sure if he has any comments he wants to make with regards to marine protected areas, but he's, we maybe get him to jump in here as well.
Yep. And Minister Wilkinson, I found Minister Jordan's comments that how do we ensure young people and increasingly diverse cross-section of Canadian society gets engaged in ocean, cultivating their love of oceans. We usually have this conversation as it pertains to terrestrial ecosystems. I'd be interested in your thoughts on how the Government of Canada can work with other organizations to ensure that as we move forward on the nature agenda, we are engaging the broadest cross-section of Canadians. And any additional thoughts you have on, a couple of years ago, the federal government made a historic investment in protecting nature, rolled out hundreds of millions of dollars in financing for new protected areas as part of its attempt to achieve 17% protection by 2020. And now the overall level of ambition has increased. And as Rebecca pointed out earlier, we're looking to the federal government to make yet another historic investment to move this next round forward.
Well, I guess what I would say is a little bit sort of riffing off, I guess, what I said before, which is one of the things I think we have to recognize with respect to protection, nature protection in this country, is that it is very different depending on where you're talking about in this country. So it's really, really important that we are protecting areas of great biodiversity and intact ecosystems like Torngat National Park or Nahanni National Park Reserve or Talayutu-Pimanga in the north. But those are places where most Canadians will never go. And so it's also important that we are thinking about how we actually are creating natural spaces and places for people to be able to connect with nature that are proximate to where people live. We are increasingly an urbanized society. So we live very close to the American border, by and large, most of us. We are a society where young people are increasingly on their screens on an ongoing basis. And we are a society that is increasingly diverse. And many people are coming from places in the world to live here where they haven't had the same kind of experience with the outdoors and wild spaces, perhaps as some of us who grew up here in past years. And so one of the things we really do need to do is try to figure out how do we connect people with nature. That's exactly why we're talking about things like urban parks, about ecological corridors that could include areas like the ravines in Toronto, could include things like the Meewasin Valley Authority in Saskatoon, or the areas around Edmonton. And so part of it is really about bringing nature closer to people to ensure that we are connecting them. And I would say that some of the folks that are on here, certainly the Nature Canada or the Nature Kids conversation, is exactly along the lines of what we want to be doing more of on a go forward basis.
Great. So we've had lots of great questions already, but if anyone participating in this event thinks of a question during our discussion, you can drop it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your webinar screen. If you're watching live on Facebook, put your questions in the comment section. So let's get started with a few of the questions that have come in. Right now, Canada is facing multiple crises: a health crisis, the economic consequences of the pandemic, and of course, the twin crises of species collapse and climate change. We had a lot of questions come in about the green recovery. Can you both speak to how your ministries can integrate nature into a green economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic? Minister Jordan, let's start with you. Are there opportunities for conservation and restoration to be part of the Blue Economy strategy you launched earlier this month, for instance?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think there can be a green recovery without it having a blue part of it. It's got to be a blue recovery as well. The ocean is going to play a significant role in our recovery. That's one of the reasons why the Blue Economy strategy is going to be important, because it's not just about, how we address the economic concerns that we're going to be facing, but how do we make sure that we're doing it in a sustainable way? Making sure that our oceans are healthy for generations to come is going to be extremely important. And this, of course, all plays into the circular economy. We've done some great work so far with regards to some of the programs that we've put in place. We could expand on things like the Ghost Gear Fund, that is putting communities to work with harvesters to retrieve ghost gear, to bring it out of the water, but not just to bring it out of the water, but to make sure that it's recycled properly and doesn't just end up in landfill. We've had some great success with this program. I can see this as a way that we can expand on it. It puts coastal Canadians to work, and it's doing great work to clean up the oceans.
Mm-hmm. Great. Minister Wilkinson, how do you see the nature agenda connecting with the green recovery?
I think it's a good question, because when people are often, not just in Canada, but in other countries around the world, talking about a green recovery, they're normally talking mainly about climate, right? About climate mitigation in particular. And that's obviously critically important. But I do think that there are elements of a green recovery that can and should relate to nature, that actually can help us from a stimulus perspective in terms of getting people back to work. One of those programs I referenced earlier, but the commitment to plant 2 billion trees and to invest in wetland and grassland restoration will create significant near-term employment. Will have a benefit of carbon sequestration, but also will have potential significant biodiversity benefits. I mean, the 2 billion trees was really part of the climate plan, but I will tell you that from my perspective, it's actually even more important from a biodiversity perspective about replanting seismic lines in areas of caribou habitat, for example. Those are areas where we can actually get economic benefit, we can get biodiversity benefit, we can get climate benefit. I would say that I think there's opportunities in Parks Canada to do some work there. We'll create near-term economic activity and enhance the ecological integrity of our parks. I think that there is more work that we can do with respect to things like the Indigenous Guardians programs, which will generate employment, but will also help us to advance the conservation agenda. So absolutely, I do think there are many ways in which they intersect, some of which have already been funded.
Can I just add to that what Jonathan said with regards to, the 2 billion trees? When we also look at habitat degradation and what has happened, for example, on the West Coast with regards to salmon habitat, and making sure that we're rebuilding that, the 2 billion trees will have an impact there as well, because we want to make sure that, that salmon, which are critical to BC, not only economically but culturally, that we rebuild the habitat that they need. So it's definitely, doing one thing has many impacts, I think, is what we're trying to say.
That's an excellent segue into my next question, which comes to us from the Wilderness Committee in British Columbia. The Roberts Bank Terminal 2 expansion project is undergoing an environmental assessment. The panel found that building the shipping terminal would have significant adverse impacts on terrestrial and marine species at risk in the key biodiversity area of the Fraser Delta, as well as adverse impacts to the current use of lands and resources and cultural heritage for several First Nations. Minister Wilkinson, will you be making a final decision around the project soon? And Minister Jordan, any comments on the potential impact to the marine environment, considering the importance of the Fraser Estuary to salmon and killer whale populations? Minister Wilkinson?
Sure. Let me speak to sort of how this kind of project assessment gets done. Given that I am an arbiter in this particular case, I have to be careful about how far I go in terms of expressing an opinion one way or the other. But certainly projects go through a review. This one went through a panel review. The panel has reported there were a number of findings of adverse environmental impacts. There are a whole range of issues on which more information is required, and we have asked for more information from the port. The way in which the process works is we must assess if in fact my determination is that even with mitigation measures there remain significant adverse effects. It has to go to cabinet for a governor and council decision, and that it must decide whether or not it is justified to go forward or not. But I would just tell you that where there are significant negative adverse impacts, those need to be addressed. And there has to be a way to find pathways to ensure that we address those in a thoughtful way if projects are to proceed. That's not true. That's not just true with Roberts Bank. That's true with every project that goes through the process. So that is ongoing. And with respect to timeline, I'm sure there's information on the public registry, but I think we are still waiting for information.
Minister Jordan?
Yeah, thanks. And you know, I mean, as Jonathan said, any kind of impacts have to be addressed. And with regards to, you know, the Fraser Estuary specifically, with regards to salmon stocks, you know, we recognize that this is a species that it's in serious decline, and we need to do everything we can to not only protect it, but to be able to grow it to abundance. And that's one of the reasons, like in my mandate letter that's just been updated, that the Prime Minister has tasked me with coming up with a Pacific salmon strategy to make sure that we are addressing the concerns. And that would be everything in terms of salmon with regards to habitat, climate change, fishing, First Nations. All of it is going to play a part in you know, making sure that we're addressing the concerns that we're seeing around the decline of the salmon in the Fraser River.
We have a question here from the Mushkegowuk Council in Northern Ontario, who support Canada's goal of expanding protected areas to 25% of land, freshwater, and ocean by 2025 and 30% by 2030. In fact, they're already in discussions with Parks Canada about a national marine conservation area across James Bay and Hudson Bay.
Yep.
They write that the terrestrial part of their traditional territory is home to the second largest carbon sink in the world and the largest wetlands in North America. They see these peatlands as the breathing and cooling lands for the ocean. They want to know if Canada will prioritize the James Bay lowlands in efforts to meet our protected areas targets. Minister Wilkinson, can you comment on this? I'd also be interested in hearing from both of you more broadly about other ways the federal government can put Indigenous-led conservation at the center of protected area efforts.
Sure. The short answer is yes. The Hudson Bay Lowlands is a very high priority in our thinking around protected spaces, in part because of exactly what has been said. It is really important from an intact carbon perspective that carbon is not disturbed. It is also an important area from a biodiversity perspective. And so in the context of our thinking around 25 by 25 and 30 by 30, certainly those are conversations that we have been having and will continue to have with local First Nations and with many others. So number one, it is a priority. Certainly in terms of Indigenous-led conservation, I mean, you will know under the Canada Nature Fund that the majority of projects that were funded under there were Indigenous led, or certainly there were strong Indigenous participation in the proposals. My expectation is that will continue as we move towards 25 by 25. We have had, great success in working in partnership with Indigenous peoples in the protection of really critical spaces, including, for example, the Jumbo Valley here in British Columbia. So absolutely. I mean, that is a firm commitment. And I would also say, we would look to expand some of the work we've done with respect to Indigenous Guardians programs, which I think also the pilot program has been very successful.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And Minister Jordan, how would you see the question of working with Indigenous nations and communities integrated into your ocean conservation work?
Well, of course, I mean, there cannot be ocean conservation work unless we are working with in partnership with First Nations. And we've had some really great success, of course, in the north with the Kekatani Inuit Association with regards to our marine protected areas there. This has been a significantly a significant partnership that has really, shown what it's like to work together. And I think that has set the bar for us in terms of where we go in terms of working with First Nations communities. I will also say, that one of the things that I think is really important too is that as we modernize the Fisheries Act in the last 2 years, making sure Indigenous knowledge is part of our decision process, and it is now in the legislation. It's now part of what we have to do as we go forward. We can't just walk away from Indigenous participation. It has to be something that's going to play a key role in all of the marine ecosystem management that we're doing. So I think that's one of the things. And I think, when we had some of our roundtables last week with regards to the Blue Economy strategy, I had one woman, a Mi'kmaq woman from Nova Scotia, who said to me, "Can you just make sure we're at the table?" And I said, we can't have a blue economy strategy unless we have Indigenous voices, because, they've been using the ocean. The First Nations have been using the ocean space for thousands and thousands of years. Of course, that their knowledge is going to be key and critical as we move forward with this strategy.
So one of the themes of Nature Canada's work right now, and the nature community more broadly, is something we've already been discussing, which is the commitment to expand protected areas to 25% of land, freshwater and oceans by 2025 and 30% by 2030. I would argue that this is probably the most important nature conservation commitment in Canadian history. A few weeks ago, President Biden announced that the United States would also work to protect 30% of its lands, freshwater, and oceans by 2030. As you know, nature doesn't respect political boundaries. North America's great ecological corridors and hundreds of species cross the Canada-US border: caribou on land, migratory birds in the air, and North Atlantic right whales and southern resident killer whales in the ocean, for example. Last week, Nature Canada released a report called Allies for Nature, outlining the ways the Canadian government can collaborate with the United States as they join in the pursuit of an ambitious nature agenda. How will your ministries work with the Biden administration on conservation? And how does the United States' renewed enthusiasm for expanding protected areas change the game in terms of global leadership for nature? Why don't we start with you, Minister Jordan?
Thank you. And, it's great to have the United States taking a leadership role. Canada has been playing a significant role globally for the last 5 years. So it's really nice to see the U.S. Coming back on board with regards to the Paris Agreement, as well as with their commitment to 30% by 2030. And of course, DFO has worked closely with NOAA on, as you mentioned, things like the right whale measures, the southern resident killer whales. Of course, invasive species in the Great Lakes is another area where we've collaborated. Those are all going to be extremely important discussions that we have with regards to protection, with regards to marine protected areas, making sure that we're working in sync with the United States, because, as you said, there is no boundaries when it comes to those kinds of protections that need to be put in place. So I'm looking forward to having those conversations with my counterparts in the U.S. to continue to look at how we can best address concerns that we're having, for example, with regards to the North Atlantic right whales, particularly right now. We just announced our new measures yesterday to strengthen the measures around protection of this species. We only have 366 of them left, and I know that it's going to be critically important that we work with the U.S. to do everything we can to protect that species.
And Minister Wilkinson, how do you specifically see this opportunity playing out? What are the mechanisms and opportunities for greater collaboration?
Well, I think there's three areas probably that right off the go we're very interested in working with the Americans on, and I think they're very interested in working on these issues as well. One would be the Migratory Birds Convention, where President Trump, former President Trump, had made some changes to the interpretation of that treaty, and I think we would like to see that rolled back, and I think that the Biden administration is interested in moving that direction. The second is the protection of ANWR, where the issues around the porcupine caribou herd and the concerns of the Gwich'in people were front and center in advocacy we were doing with the Trump administration. But the Biden administration is very interested in putting in place permanent protection with respect to ANWR. And then the ecological corridors issue. In the context of them looking to go to 30 by 30, we want to ensure that we're thinking about these migratory pathways So Yellowstone to Yukon, the Appalachians, there are a number of others where we would like to work with them to ensure that we're actually taking joint action that is going to benefit the ecological integrity of these corridors. More generally, in terms of the international arena, I mean, I think the U.S. rejoining and being a proponent of 30 by 30 will be very helpful in terms of catalyzing further action. But let's be clear: there's been action going on with respect to this issue in prior to the election of President Biden. I mean, the High Ambition Coalition is led by France and Costa Rica, who have both done great work in terms of pushing this on the international agenda. I think the Americans coming back into the conversation is going to be very helpful. But this was an important conversation that was being had around the world prior to the election of President Biden. Can I just say one other thing? I see in the chat there's a number of folks who've asked me to clarify what I meant on the eastern slopes, and I probably didn't fully explain what I meant. What I meant when I said it doesn't count was you cannot actually have industrial activity within a marine refuge and still count it as part of the protected areas. That was part of the guidelines or the rules that Canada put into place with respect to what counts with respect to our conservation objectives. We are one of the only countries in the world that has actually put forward clear guidelines or clear requirements as to what actually can count as a protected space and what can't. Most other countries are a little bit more fluid in terms of their interpretation. We have been very clear, and it cannot count.
Thank you. Last question, and this is one that we've received a lot of similar queries on out of Western Canada, and it's about open pit coal mining in the Rockies and the potential impacts of selenium downstream in Alberta, as well as Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Many terrestrial and freshwater species are at further risk from coal mining impacts, for example, cutthroat trout and grizzly bears. Minister Wilkinson, what can the federal government do to protect the environment against these potentially very harmful projects?
Well, I think what people are largely referring to is the proposal by the Alberta government to essentially open up the Eastern Slopes area for coal mining. This was an area that was largely protected and had been protected since the government of Peter Lougheed in Alberta, and the current government of Alberta had opened it up for leases that were mainly coal related. I expressed concern about that decision by the government of Alberta when they did that, because this is an area that is largely intact from an ecosystem perspective. It is an important area for grizzly bear and for caribou at a time when we are looking to further protect these spaces, these kinds of intact areas. It seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. But what I would say is, people in Alberta had their voices heard. I mean, they came out very strongly in opposition to the decision that was taken. To the credit of the government there, they heard that, and they have put back in place the act. I think there will be continuing conversation Albertans will be having with their government about some of the leases that were let in the interim period that have not been rolled back. And that issue will continue. With respect to, any of these mining projects, in particular coal projects, they would have to meet certain kinds of environmental requirements. The land use policy is a provincial issue, but in terms of anything that touches federal jurisdiction, so if there was a coal plant that was built perhaps somewhere else, it would have to meet certain kinds of requirements, and that includes fish and fish habitat, and it will include strict requirements with respect to selenium discharges. We are working right now on coal effluent regulations, similar to the metal mines effluent regulations that are already in place, that will specify what they must do with respect to selenium discharges in the future.
So time has flown, and even though there's so much to discuss, we're lucky for the time we did have with two very busy parliamentarians. So the time has come to say goodbye to the ministers, and on behalf of the whole team in Nature Canada and the nature community across the country, thank you for making the time to have this important discussion with us. And we're all eager to see what comes next for protecting nature and supporting Indigenous-led conservation.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent questions from our audience today. Thank you for all of those, and sorry we couldn't get to everything that has come in. I'm going to turn it back now to our MC, Gowri Srinivasan. Gowri?
Great. Just working to, there we go. I wasn't sure who was in charge of my video, me or them. What a great discussion with the ministers. Thank you, Graham. There were so many important questions and issues raised by the nature community and from all of our supporters across the country. It's really, I don't know, I was struck by it's like, how is everything connected? How does committing to big conservation goals mean that we need to rethink how we think about major projects, everything from coal to big port terminals off the coast of Vancouver, and also, of course, oil and gas off the coast of Newfoundland. I think it is going to be an ongoing conversation with both ministers on that. I think on the one hand, it's good and fair to say if you have an oil exploration license, that part's not going to count as corrected, but in a fluid environment where you're trying to protect fragile ecosystems, can we really have a kind of a Swiss cheese protection framework in a marine refuge where you can have extensive oil and gas development right here, and then right next to it you have development. So I think there's an ongoing conversation about how do we keep nimble but also effective protections going as we deal with tough questions around economic development. But I was really pleased to see the important ways that conservation and restoration of ecosystems is also offering the opportunity for support to sustainable economic activity and to local livelihoods. Lots of great focus on the key role of Indigenous guardians in First Nation communities, and both in a terrestrial sense and on ocean. There's been ocean watcher programs. And I think there's a lot of a discussion to be had about these trade-offs between kind of an older way of thinking about economic growth and what's the kind of economy we need going forward. But what struck you?
Yeah, I thought it was a really good conversation. We didn't really explore in as much detail as I think we could have the nature-based climate solutions, which is really one of the core themes that's emerging right now out of the federal government. The 2 billion tree initiative, thinking about how you can twin restoration of wetlands and grasslands to nature-based climate solutions, and the critical role of protecting intact ecosystems. I mean, the boreal forest in Canada, there's twice as much carbon stored in the boreal forest than in all of the world's proven oil reserves combined. So the way in which the nature conversation and the climate conversation are coming together in a way that will help us address simultaneously the twin crises of species collapse and climate change is an important emerging theme. But I was quite happy to hear the minister talk candidly about some very specific things out of the U.S.-Canada relationship. I thought the reference to the migratory bird treaty and change and rolling back the negative measures that Trump had taken was a good one. I was really happy to hear him specifically mention Alaska and Yukon and ANWR in terms of the critical role of the critical importance of protecting those areas, especially for caribou migrations. And I was really happy to hear him think continentally about the great ecological corridors, Yellowstone to Yukon, the great forests of the East Coast, and grassland ecosystems. And really, if we want to protect species, we're going to need to be thinking about it at a hemispheric or continental level.
Yeah, it was great to see their excitement at the prospect of the ability to work kind of across the border with the U.S. So they're excited about the thought of having the U.S. back as a partner. Bringing more people into the conversation, more countries into the conversation is a great idea. Maybe just end with a last comment before we wrap up, that the whole discussion of how we pay more attention to growing a more diversified access to nature and really supporting the ability of all Canadians to both enjoy and benefit from nature was a key theme. I think we still have some work to do to think about how it's not just about introducing people to nature, but it's really about the obligation to reduce barriers and access. So I was really pleased to hear the commitment to think about expanding park and green space in core urban areas. But I think we have to do a lot more work to think about what are the other barriers that are there, everything from income inequality to ensuring park and protected spaces are safe and welcoming places for brown and black Canadians. And I think there's work to do in our community, the whole conservation community, to do that. The government will have to do more as well. It's more than just outreach about explaining the joys of nature. But it seems to be a strong theme for the government. So I think together there's a lot of work we can do to build a broader movement. I really want to again thank Jordy and Miriam and Rebecca for their questions. I hope we offered you a bit of opportunity to feel like those questions were heard and we came back to them. There's more conversation to be had. Maybe just to wrap up where we are now, thanking again all of you, our viewers. We've had over 1,000 participants sign up for this webinar. We know so many more are watching live today on Facebook. The turnout alone really underscores how Canadians have big hopes for nature and big expectations for action and investment by the federal government. We want to invite Nature Canada, we want to invite all of you to join this movement. If you've stayed this long on the webinar, you care enough to know that all of our voices and our actions matter. So we're going to ask you to send a letter to your own Member of Parliament and the Minister of Finance right now. Show support for the critical need for investments in nature and conservation in the upcoming federal budget. We think we need at least $5 billion over the next 5 years to give us a chance of being able to protect Canada's land and oceans by 25% by 2025. So take this action now. You can see the where you go on the website, naturecanada.ca/take action. Then you will be part of what was a kind of a historic week of raising our voices on Parliament Hill, digitally on screens, and you too in our home, to tell our decision makers that nature is really critical, both for our own health and the health of the wildlife that we all love now and into the future. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again.